So, thank you very much. I would like to start thanking Professor Ann and Professor Ilaria and all the other esteemed colleagues for having me here. I would like to thank also Birmingham City University for the opportunity to present the Brazilian constitutional system, which is still barely unknown, despite it's already reached 30 years, but we insist in writing and talking in Portuguese, so this is kind of a problem, which I'm trying to overcome a little bit in that seminar. The summary of my presentation, I'm going to start with a little bit of history, because you cannot understand a national constitution without linking it to the national history. And although it's quite of a established system, it is very important to understand the political ambience in which it came in 1988. The second part of my presentation will involve a very broad draft of the Brazilian constitution design that came from the National Constituent Assembly in 1988. And we will have a brief overview about the institutional design and the two pillars in which our national constitution is established. And in the third part, I will address the challenges we're facing after this 30 years of constitutional application and experimentation. The National Constituent Assembly in Brazil was held in 1987 and ended in 88. It was summoned after a 20 years old period of military dictatorship. The redemocratization in Brazil at that time came as a result of a burnout of the military coup, which led the military forces to power. So they felt that they were not able to retain power anymore. Political forces were rearranging, and so it was perceived that it was time to turn into a democratic model. But it was a highly negotiated process because none of the forces were with that much of a strength. So the militaries were going out, but they were intending to preserve their own positions, as usually when a dictatorship ends. And the progressive forces that came into power were stepping with very carefully, because they felt that the political ambience was very fragile. And we didn't have at the National Constituent Assembly a majority from any of those positions. So it was a very diverse National Constituent Assembly in which you have progressive forces represented, but also very conservative forces also represented. There was no sensitive political rupture, therefore negotiation was the main word at the National Constituent Assembly. And in such a diverse scenery, building consensus was very difficult. Each and every point, each and every aspect was highly debated, and the alternative that the political forces faced at the time was to bring to the Constitution very broad concepts in which they could find some sort of consensus, and then let the details to be brought by the ordinary legislative procedure. So you have a constitutional clause, for example, granting the right to property. So the right to property is granted. And the next command in the Constitution was mentioning property should obey the social function. And what is social function? The Constitution didn't detail this. The idea was that throughout the ordinary legislative procedure, this should be established. And it indeed happened. We have a lot of laws being approved after this, detailing what is the social function of property. So the Parliament used, the National Constituent Assembly used a lot there's a paper of Cass Sunstein in which he mentions constitutional agreement without constitutional theories. So they brought to the test the possible agreement and let the rest to be decided along the ordinary political life. Social exclusion was a main concern in the National Constituent Assembly. The progressive forces were very sensible to the need to overcome social exclusion. Therefore, constitutional clauses on human rights appear to be a solution. So the Brazilian Constitution is very generous in granting human rights, all of them. Liberty rights, socioeconomic rights, present and future, implicit and explicit. So you have a constitutional clause which says that whatever treaty the Brazil subscribed in the human rights field, it will be taken as a constitutional clause protecting human rights. So in Article 5, for instance, in which you have the main list of human rights, you have more than 70 different human rights listed. But you also have Article 6, in which you have socioeconomic rights, Article 196 with a right to health, and a lot of them spread all over the Constitution. To the progressive forces, this was an important tool because they think, well, we're going to put those rights in the Constitution, and the political process will develop these rights. And a second feature that the Constitution embraces also is a very developed institutional set dedicated to provide that legislative development. So you have a very strong, a very protected judiciary, but you also have the prosecutor's office, which in Brazil represents public interest also. You have what we call the public defender's office, which is highly spread in the country and is very relevant in order to grant those fundamental rights. You have the public advocacy, in which I work. So a very large institutional set dedicated to overcome any blockage in the political process related with the development of those human rights. So this is the model which our Constitution embraced. And this is very coherent with the Latin American historical context. In Latin America history, constitutions will be usually built as a pact among the elites. So the idea will be, okay, let's order somehow power, but granting the huge portion for ourselves. It's also a very common feature in Latin American constitutions that the executive will have a very significant role in the political functioning, because it's easier to control the executive branch than to control parliament. Therefore, hyper-presidentialism would be a very common feature in Latin American constitutions. There's a skepticism towards the legislative and its passions, and transformative commitments. This was a new trend in Latin American constitutions at the time. The idea will be that the Constitution will be the trigger to transformation and to overcome social exclusion. After Brazil, we have the same sort of modeling in Colombia's constitution, and Ecuador, Bolivia, and many others in the country, in the